Next up is our first panel discussion that will dive into one of the most challenging and important questions for groundwater in Texas, one that was just brought up in several questions posed to Chief Hecht, how GCDs can protect a resource that is both privately owned and collectively shared. GCDs face a difficult task in managing groundwater resources, working within a framework shaped by state law, court decisions, and local needs. Today's panel will explore how districts navigate these challenges, strike a balance, and continue to serve the communities. Moderating this discussion is Vanessa Pugh-Williams. She's the Director of EDF Texas Water Program and also the Board President at Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District. Please join me in welcoming the panelists and Vanessa to the stage.
Nice to see y'all. That was jumping right into the deep end with that interview. Very interesting, for sure. While everyone's getting situated, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. As Adam said, my name is Vanessa Puig-Williams. I run the Texas Water Program for Environmental Defense Fund. Our focus is on advancing sustainable groundwater management in the state, and I have the pleasure of working with many of y'all on a day-to-day basis. So we have a really experienced group. Some of y'all are seasoned TAG panelists, and I think, Tiffany, this might be your first TAG second. Okay, all right. So I really appreciate y'all spending time. I'm going to introduce each one of these panelists. To my left, we have Gary Westbrook. Gary is the general manager of the Post Oak Groundwater Conservation District, which is located between Austin and College Station, where you're having various pressures on groundwater resources, including the Vista Ridge groundwater project that many of us know about, that is transporting groundwater from Burleson County to the city of San Antonio. Next, we have Carlos Rubenstein. Carlos is the former chairman of the Texas Water Development Board and former commissioner at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. He's now a private consultant, and you work a lot with clients who are concerned about protecting and conserving their groundwater, communities, landowners. Next is Tiffany. Tiffany Dow-Lashmet is an attorney and an associate professor and extension specialist in ag law. And Tiffany's work focuses on the legal issues affecting Texas's agricultural producers and landowners. So it'll be a good perspective to have for this conversation. And then finally, we have Ed McCarthy. Ed is an attorney with McCarthy & McCarthy, and you have a long experience practicing water law in Texas. Ed's represented many different types of clients on water right issues, but many of us in the groundwater community know Ed for representing landowners who are looking to develop or produce their groundwater. Okay, so again, thank you all very much for being here today. So we are going to talk today about the balancing act, how groundwater conservation districts do the impossible. How do they manage a privately owned yet shared resource, as Adam said? And really, the last few months, if you've been reading the news, there's been a lot of focus on this question and the extent to which groundwater conservation districts have the authority to regulate groundwater production and the extent to which landowners have the right to produce groundwater beneath their property. That's been a big focus because of a big groundwater project in East Texas that has been proposed before the Natchez and Trinity Valley Groundwater Conservation District. It has thousands of landowners in the region concerned about what this project might mean for their own privately owned groundwater, how it's going to affect their rights. And it's caused leadership at the Texas legislature, Chairman Cody Harris, Representative Trent Ashby, and Senator Robert Nichols to propose legislation during both of the last special session and now this current one that just started on Friday to give groundwater conservation districts more teeth to address this large-scale groundwater production, often that we see with export projects. We are not going to discuss the details of this case, so if you came here today to hear about that, you're going to be disappointed. I just mention it because it has ignited a conversation about the role of groundwater conservation districts and how we think about private ownership, and so it's made this discussion, which we were already planning on having actually before all that, even more timely. Okay, so we had a pretty, which I said, deep dive into groundwater ownership and case law just now with that very interesting conversation with Chief Justice Hecht. But I know that there are probably a lot of people here that are kind of confused about what was discussed, and I thought just before we get into some of our questions, I'm going to ask Tiffany if you could provide a quick overview of the nature of groundwater ownership in Texas and what groundwater conservation districts, or GCDs, for those of y'all who are very new to this conversation, what they can and cannot do.
Sure. Well, thanks, Vanessa, for coordinating this and getting all of our ducks in a row here. You've been great to get our panel ready to go. Yeah, like she said, Chief Justice Hecht really hit on a lot of the major cases related to Texas groundwater law, but we'll just kind of run through them again briefly. The big picture Texas groundwater law, right? Groundwater in Texas is privately owned. It's owned by the surface owner who owns the land. Now, caveat to that, groundwater rights could be severed off, right? And you might have a situation where you've got a severed groundwater right separate from the surface owner. But most of the time, it's the surface owner who owns that groundwater beneath their property. And in the East case back in 1904, that's where the Texas Supreme Court said that in Texas, groundwater law is governed by the rule of capture, which means you've got the right to drill a well and produce your water, and you're not liable for damages at law if doing so causes harm to your neighbor's well, right? You don't have damages at law, right? That's not your remedy. What's the remedy? If your well goes dry, you can drill a bigger, deeper well, right? And so some legal scholars refer to Texas groundwater law as the law of the biggest pump because of that approach. If we fast forward about a century, we get to the Day case, which was a big topic of discussion with Chief Justice Hecht. And that case held that you have a right not only to produce that water beneath your land, but that the groundwater owner also has a property interest, a constitutionally protected property interest in the groundwater in place beneath the land. So that was a really important decision from the court. And in that decision, the court did affirm that private ownership rule of capture as well. That led then next to the Bragg case, which is where we had a decision from the San Antonio Court of Appeals that said if there is an entity like the Edwards Aquifer Authority that's regulating groundwater use and limiting or prohibiting groundwater owners' use of that water, under certain circumstances, that regulation may go so far as to constitute a regulatory taking for which that landowner is owed just compensation. Now, all these rules obviously are not unlimited, as you all in this room know, right? Certain areas of the state are governed by groundwater conservation districts. And we've got about 100 of those across the state. All of them have different rules, some related to pumping and production and spacing and permitting. But there are some areas on the map, if you look at the map, there's white areas, right, where there is no regulation. And those areas, it's the Wild West, and there's not an entity that's governing groundwater production. So there's your semester of water law in 3 minutes.
In 2 minutes, very good. Well, let me just follow up, because there was a gentleman here that asked a question that I think was an important one, which is, groundwater is privately owned. So then how is it that the state can tell landowners what to do with it? Is it because it's in the Constitution? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's the exact answer, right? The Constitution grants the state the authority to manage natural resources in Texas. The state decided the best way to do that, instead of having a board in Austin who oversees groundwater, is to allow for local control through groundwater conservation districts.
So even though you own your groundwater in place, it's private property, it's still subject to regulation by a groundwater conservation district. Okay. All right, so going to move on to Gary. We talked a little bit, we heard from Justice Hecht about allocation of groundwater. And so I thought that was interesting about Robert Mesa's question about correlative rights. And is that the only way to do it versus there being other ways where you're looking at what's needed versus tying that to land ownership? So you, Gary, as I had mentioned earlier, have a lot of pressures in your district. With an export permit, you have ag in your district, you've got a lot of local landowners and utilities, you kind of have all of it. What are you doing to protect property rights? And how are you ensuring that groundwater is being managed to so that it's available in the long term?
Yeah, so that's always been a challenge, and you heard the Q&A a while ago. As much as I appreciate the back and forth, I think a lot of us were hoping for some more specificity in those answers. But
You're never going to get that from.
well, you're correct, and he said, it still is up to the legislature, and of course, the legislature is subject to the courts. But to answer your question, for us, we use a modified correlative right. And it's based on a division of availability in some reasonable amount amongst the users, and that's really probably the simplest way to put it. When new users decide that they would like access to the property, we continue to evaluate the availability of water, and we might someday adjust the amount of water that's available on a contiguous acreage basis. But looking long term, I think we look at the desired future conditions in the GMA process. For those of you that are not familiar with that, there's some folks coming up later that'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. But adopting desired future conditions, we've been trained for 25 years to look 50 years into the future. And we're going to start looking further than that. Desired future conditions is a quantitative description of what you desire your aquifer resource to look like at some point in the future. And 25 years, 50 years, that's great. Anybody here want to have great grandkids? Great grandkids have some water? Well, we've started trying to get our GMA to look even further into the future, because I think that's going to matter in the not too distant future. We've got some places where aquifers are being stressed, and other places where maybe there's still plenty, but sooner or later, these are finite resources. Some of them recharge, but it's very slow comparatively. We're very blessed with large sand aquifers in our area, but over time, there's going to be some problems. And so we're trying to look long-term at that. We have some other things that we do. Groundwater districts can adopt spacing requirements. That's one way to help protect landowners one from another. We've developed a rule that we call unreasonable impacts. We're going through a 5-year review right now, and we're looking at wells and how much impact they have on neighbors, groups of wells, and how much compounded impact they have on their neighbors. And we'll be having some hearings sometime next year to make possible adjustments to some of the permits that have been issued. So there's a lot of growth to be had in water management, groundwater management, but that's just kind of a brief synopsis of what we're doing.
That's helpful. So Chief Justice Heck, I heard him say several times that it's about reasonableness, it's about balance. Do you think that your district is living up to that?
That's a loaded question again.
I keep asking those.
Yeah. No, but it's a fair question. Trust me, we have a large portion of folks back home that want to know the same thing. Why aren't you guys doing your job? I mean, these wells are being affected, and you've developed a program to help people lower their pumps. If you were doing your job, we wouldn't have to do that. Well, if you fix it to where there's no water level change, then there's no water produced. So, it's a balancing act. Do I think we've done a good job? Yes.
You think you're achieving that balance?
I think so, because we've also spent a lot of time and effort and money trying to improve the science that we use for evaluations. And we continue to try to make that better. And that's the only way I know to do it, is trial, error, continue to monitor water levels, and continue to make the science better. Okay.
Well, there's going to be a lot of talk about that at this conference, but maybe we can get back to that in a second. But Carlos, I'm going to move to you. So as I mentioned, you work a lot with landowners who are particularly interested in ensuring that their groundwater resources are conserved for the long term, that they're conserved in place. So can you explain what that means, and how does a groundwater conservation district ensure that groundwater can be conserved in place?
You bet. No question. Happy to address that. I'm going to take off from where Gary left it. There's one thing that, among the many things that I know your district does and does well, and I mean that sincerely, is you have found a way to monetize conservation. And I think monetizing conservation is a way of ensuring that there's going to be water for the future. You asked how many of us plan to have grandkids. Well, I already have 5 5 granddaughters, and I want them to be able to have water in the future and their kids to also have water. And so it's something that is near and dear. The problem that I see is that we all talk about the fact that we have a balancing act requirement, but the balance is tilted. And it's tilted for various reasons, and we can get into them if we want to, but it's tilted towards production. And I think of late, we've been starting to think about, well, what about tomorrow? Is it okay to have desired future conditions that still largely call for continuous depletion, managed depletion of our aquifer? Is that sustainable? So I think those things are starting to enter the topic of discussion. I think in the previous Q&A, we absolutely heard that you have a right to ownership in place. Look, when I first started working for the state 40 plus years ago, it's been a while, I actually started as a waste inspector, not having to do with water. But one of the things that we had to deal with was groundwater contamination. And we learned then that if you pump and treat, you influence the way the water is going to move. Well, if you pump and produce, you're influencing that movement. And so I think it goes back to a hearing you and I attended maybe 4 years ago, when the first concerns about Vista Ridge were where people said, oh, we didn't know this was going to happen, yet the models had been around for a while. There was one gentleman that made a comment during that hearing that I have not found a more articulate way of saying it. He said, look, people decided to offer their groundwater rights, their leases, to be part of that project. They had a right to do that. You remember this hearing. I chose as an owner not to do that. However, because that project is now in place, it's impacting my well, and I never wanted to be part of that project.
Yeah, because, sorry to interrupt you, but just because this goes back to what Tiffany was saying, is that in oil and gas, the remedy was, will you drill another well? That may not be the case with groundwater. It shouldn't be the case, because landowners might want to ensure that it's there in the future, or maybe they have a spring on their property that they'd like to know will keep flowing.
Right, but I think it's deeper than that, because the question is about the preservation of the property right. Mm-hmm. This gentleman, he exercised his property interest by not wanting to be part of that project. He had every right to do that. But then, because the project is in place, and yes, the aquifer dropped, and in some places 100 foot or so in 18 months or more, he says now somebody else is monetizing my property rights to groundwater for their pecuniary gain. And I think that that's the problem where we're not achieving the true balance that is called for. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed. Do we have an answer? No.
Well, you said that Gary's district, Post Oak, is monetizing conservation. So what do you mean by that? So
Gary's district, and I'm surprised you didn't mention it in your answer. Okay, there you go. You teed me off really well there then. They will pay folks, look, it's all about contiguous land, because in his district you get so many acre feet per contiguous acre. Well, if you don't want to participate in a project, but you want to realize a monetary gain so you don't have that financial pressure to participate in a project. I'm trying to explain your program. No, but go ahead.
All right, so we do require contiguous acreage. We also have spacing requirements, maximum allowables. We use all the tools in the toolbox. What do you do long term? And a lot of districts have said, hey, we'd like to do that too. Well, the problem is you have to have the funds to do it. And the only way to get the funds to do it is to issue permits to export water. Well, so it's catch-22, but we take some of the fees that we collect from the export and we pay people not to lease, because there's still leasing efforts going on in our district. And so we compensate landowners not to be part of those projects, to try and slow down those projects in their growth and try to prolong impacts throughout our area.
So from a water policy perspective, I think what you're doing is you're relieving the owner's pressure for realizing an economic benefit, or for keeping somebody, as that gentleman eloquently said during the hearing, of somebody monetizing his own property right by giving him an incentive and still a protection to not participate and still collectively try to protect the level of the aquifer. And I think that that's commendable.
Okay. Okay, Ed, your turn now. What do you think about conservation in place? Do you agree with what Carlos just said?
No.
Okay.
No surprise to that answer, but let me back up, because I think that the critical element of what we're talking about is science, okay? And until we know the answers to the questions, it's difficult to develop the policies. I think there are a lot of the policies that can be put in place. I think Gary's district is doing a good job in many respects with what he's doing. And the concept of correlative rights in terms of allocating a certain amount of acre foot per acre can have merit in some instances. I have had projects, and by the way, I'm speaking on behalf of myself here today, and I've had a variety of projects that have a variety of circumstances. We've tried a variety of approaches. I had a project that 10 years before mitigation was being talked about, we offered a mitigation plan. The same project, we offered a correlative rights type allocation using the model that the legislature had created with the Edwards Aquifer. And the district rejected both of those proposals. They rejected the correlative rights. I don't know why on that one. On the money part, they didn't want to be responsible for the funds. And in part, it wasn't that they weren't willing to undertake the program. I don't want to criticize them there. Their advice from council was that the legislature hasn't given us the authority to handle those private funds, and therefore we're not sure what to do with them or if we even can. And that's where the legislature needs to come into place. Let me start off with saying that the rule of capture is not in place in Texas the way you have been talking about it. We do not have the right today to pump as much water as we want, subject only to the general rules of no waste, intentional infliction of harm on your neighbor, or causing subsidence. We have a lot more rules. As Gary said, we have spacing. We have the requirement for a permit. We can't even begin to exercise the right until we get a permit. That's a critical limitation on the rule of capture. But with respect to correlative rights and other ideas, science is the basis. We have all seen, I think most of you have used in presentations the profile of an aquifer, which is always a slanted type of a landscape that shows the aquifer with a deeper and a shallower recharge area and things like that. And that's not what all aquifers look like. But assuming that is the case, then doing correlative rights doesn't work, because the number of surface acres over that very shallow part of the aquifer, to give them the same rights as somebody who is over the deepest proportion of the aquifer, doesn't make sense. They may not even have 2 acre foot per acre under this shallow aquifer. Okay? The other thing that's happened is, let's talk about the concept of DFCs and MAGs. They're not scientifically based. They're based upon what the local district decided it wanted. And in many instances, the local district decided, and I appreciate and applaud what they were trying to do, where they say, and they'll say it openly to you, we are trying to protect the permits we have issued. We want to make sure that those people have the continued right to the investment they've made, the expectation they have. Okay? That's not scientific. Now, there are other districts where I will tell you that, in my opinion, they've just decided they don't want growth, they don't want exports, so they picked a number that has nothing to do with the aquifer's health or its sustainability, but it limits production. That's not science. And that's part of the battle that I will just say, I don't want to get into it, and Vanessa, I appreciate your sort of limiting us, but that's part of what's happening in the Battle of East Texas. And the reason I say that is because that particular project is trying to develop science that the local district doesn't have. The local district isn't fighting us on gathering that science, but it's the science that needs to drive it. The other thing we have to realize, and I think we need a scientific approach to this, is what causes the drop in the aquifer? Texas law does not protect aquifer levels, okay? And Texas law cannot protect aquifer levels. It's not reasonable. It's not scientific. And the other factor is that As I understand the science, and I'm not a scientist myself, but I have spent 1 or 2 years studying it with hydrogeologists in my practice, and that is that we still have basically the same volume of water in the aquifer today that we had before Vista Ridge started pumping, that we had before a lot of these other projects started pumping. What we don't have is the artesian pressure. That means that there's as much water under your property today as there was before my clients started pumping. It's just the artesian pressure isn't there. I keep asking, isn't there somebody out there that's getting a PhD in hydrogeology or geophysics or something that can come up with some way to repressurize the aquifer? We know it can be done because we're seeing in West Texas the impacts and the seismic activity that results from injection of wastewater. There has to be a way to do this, and I would like all of us to work together to try and find that. I'm not a fan of local control. Most of you know that. The reason I'm not is because between 98 groundwater districts and the subsidence districts, I don't think any of you have rules that match up or DFCs that match up, even though many of you are regulating the same aquifer. I don't see how an aquifer or a district in one county can regulate an aquifer, the same aquifer, different from the district that's in the contiguous county.
But Ed, can I push back on that just for a second? Because earlier, I mean, you mentioned that groundwater moves, that, you know, we need more science. And so oftentimes, while there might be multiple districts managing over one aquifer, there are very unique situations that occur within districts that might mean that they need specific rules. So is there a way that we can achieve both, like more efficient management over aquifers, but still with local voice and attention to some of these more unique local hydrogeological conditions?
Well, I think the local rules and the local needs you're talking about are mostly directed by political issues or non-scientific, non-aquifer related concerns. I mean, a lot of that is politics. And I saw some very good testimony debating a proposed piece of legislation in the regular session where one of the groundwater district managers was there testifying about the internal debate going on within the GMA and the pressures that were being placed upon his district to surrender to a proposition that another district or a couple of districts wanted that they felt was contrary to the needs and benefits of their district and the aquifer underneath their district. They have very elaborate rules on spacing, production per acre foot, things like that, that they felt were protective of their district. But here, again, we don't have consistency within the districts based upon the science of the health of the aquifer. A statement I don't think anybody can disagree with. Once you pump the water from the aquifer doesn't know what's going to be done with the water. It doesn't care. The effect on the aquifer happened from the pumping. Well, what's the effect on the aquifer from the pumping? That's not the question that gets asked, in my opinion, in my experience. And that's where the science is being ignored.
Okay. A lot more that I would like to ask you, but I want to move to Tiffany because I feel like we need to come back to you. So the agricultural groups back in, I think, 2011 were when the code was amended to clarify that groundwater is a vested property right owned in place. The groups were very much in support of that. And so now we're having this conversation about, well, what does that mean? How much can a district actually regulate to restrict that use, that ownership? What is the perspective that you're hearing from the ag groups on that?
Yeah, well, I think it probably is true with a lot of agricultural issues. I'm not sure there's one aligned perspective, right? I think it probably depends on the group, on the commodity, on the part of the state that they're located in. I think all of that comes into play. And I think not unlike groundwater conservation districts, ag probably finds themselves trying to juggle this balancing act, walking a tightrope, right? On the one hand, obviously irrigated agriculture is a major use of groundwater in Texas.
Yeah.
And so I think
biggest use.
yeah, they've been in support. They've always been in support of privately owned groundwater rights and the ability to pump and produce food, et cetera. Right? So I don't think that has changed. But I do think that we also, are worried about things like conservation and making sure that our grandkids, right, have water to still have our farms that we're living on. So I think that they're right in the middle of the balancing act like everybody else. I think another issue that comes up for ag is the I don't know, the disconnect's the right word, but the tension between urban use and agriculture use of water, right? That's something that we're seeing change. You've seen the graph where, right, historically ag's been the biggest user. Now we're going to see municipal use continue to increase. And so I think there's a lot of concerns there, and they're in the middle of trying to figure out the right way to balance this and the right perspective to take. Although certainly historically ag has been in favor of, right, things like private ownership, ability to use groundwater, that type of approach.
Carlos, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to continue the discussion on the science. I agree that the science is not as developed as it should be. I don't agree with the fact that because the science is not developed as it should be, and you do have districts like Gary's that invest heavily in improving the science, that is a reason to continue to allow the pumping that's taking place. I think actually it's the other way around. If we recognize that we are using models that were never designed to give us an answer, that we are now relying on them to satisfy the answer we wanted, to justify a decision we're making, we may be selling a part of the future that we never intended to sell. And so the lack of the science in my book is a reason to be more cautious.
Okay, so Ed,
Unfortunately, we got, 1,500 people a day moving in, and they're not bringing a trailer of water with them. And
they're not even bringing a bottle.
That's where all the pressure comes from. So.
I agree. And the other one is, and Ed mentioned this, and I think we need to recognize this, and you've heard me say this in previous conferences before, to a degree, districts are set up to fail because we want to expect all districts to operate the same way. But the topography that they overlay, the geology that's underneath, the transmissivity of the water and the aquifers is not the same. So don't judge all of them against the same brush. But I think that occurs, and it's to the disadvantage of recognizing how groundwater in Texas work. I will tell you, I get to contrast what we do in groundwater with the way the state manages surface water, having been water master of the Rio Grande. That's another place where a disconnect in my mind of how we choose to manage water exists. The state regulates surface water because it owns it, and if somebody disagrees, the state defends that disagreement. Who comes and defends the GCD on a disagreement?
Actually, I'm going to go to Gary. What needs to change in the law in order to make things?
I'm king for a day.
Yeah, if you're king for a day, what needs to change in the law?
Where did Justice Heck go?
To make things clearer for groundwater conservation districts so that you can actually do your job and reasonably regulate and achieve that balance. So I want to hear you answer that, and I'd love to hear Ed's thoughts as well after that.
First off, there's a lot of districts across the state that are doing a great job, and a lot of districts that are putting an enormous portion of their budget into science. I don't want anybody to think that there's only a few, because there's a lot. But to
now
echo,
there's $7.5 million that the Water Development Board is going to have to issue out grants. So over the next 2 years,
grants for more science. So please. But I think longer term planning. I think. As I mentioned a while ago, we're stepping out on a limb. We're gonna press this issue about what's reasonable, what's a reasonable impact to have on your neighbor and their ability to access their water. Ed's right. You can depressurize that aquifer an enormous amount, and everyone still has the same amount of water in storage under their footprint of land. What changes is your ability to access it and the cost to access it. And so at what point do you say we're looking at conservation, and at what point do you say we're trying to reduce the impacts from one producer on another? Are you going to choose maybe thirds as an example? We're going to keep a third of the artesian pressure in place, and our spacing is going to reflect a third of the impact on each other between two competing neighbors. Maybe that's one way you want to do it. Maybe you go 40%, and keep it 20%. Maybe you reverse that. But what is it that your aquifer will sustain? How does your aquifer perform? And how are you going to define what's reasonable and what's not reasonable in the way of conservation and access to water and impacts? And so, and I think Chief Justice said it a while ago, what can you prove? When you get to your court day, what can you prove? Do you have the science on your side? And so that's what we're trying to identify and develop is those ways to manage that will conserve long term, but also make water available because Texas is growing. People have the right to produce their own water, to produce their living, whether they're irrigating or whether they choose to market it. I mean, that's their choice. And Ed's right. The aquifer doesn't know the difference between where the water got used. And so, those are the balances that we have to face and the policies that we have to develop and the ways that we have to go about protecting property right owners from each other.
But do you think that the law is clear enough right now for GCDs? Do you have all the authority that you need to be able to do that effectively?
I'd love to have some more teeth in what's unreasonable. I don't know. I'm not looking for specific values, but I might like to have some things tweaked that say, you know what, you do have the right to determine what's unreasonable and what's not. Instead of just saying you can consider this, you can consider that. Is it reasonable to affect stream flow? If so, how much? River authorities will need to come to the table and bring their science as well. And Carlos is right. These models that we use were developed for for regional planning 30 years ago. They were never intended to be used on site-specific evaluations. That's why we have to spend the time and the money and gather the monitoring information to make these models better. So yeah, I'd like to have some assistance there. I probably would like to have a little bit better definition of property rights, maybe see 36002 addressed. And I'll say this, everybody's excited about some of these bills, some on one side, some on the other, but the bills that have been recently filed, I hope that what we've put together over the last 22 years that I've been here in the way of Chapter 36 and how it works and all the aspects of it that have to fit together, I hope that we get a chance to do an in-depth look, a deep dive into, I heard Mike Thornhill say in the hall a while ago, want to see a forensic evaluation. How was it put together? What was the purpose? Where did you get that language? Why do we use these 9 factors? What about the rest of it? So I hope that we get a chance to look at all of it again. And now we've got science to bring to bear. We've got several large projects that have been online for a while, and we've got monitoring information. We've got a lot of information we can evaluate in that context now.
Ed, do you think the legislature needs to make any changes to Chapter 36, or is GCD authority clear?
The simple answer is yes. But just as if I had been asked if I were king for a day, what would I change? That would take a lot of time. And I'm happy to sit down and have this conversation with all of you or any of you. To be honest with you, if I were going to start changing water law, let me tell you this, I'd start with surface water law. The first thing we need to do is reverse the rule that prohibits interbasin transfers.
Amen.
I think that rule puts a great deal of stress on groundwater districts.
Can you explain what that interbasin transfer rule is?
For those of you who don't know it, there's a provision in Chapter 11 that says if you want to take water from, state's divided up into 26 river basins, the major river basins. And if you want to move water from one river basin to another river basin for a project, same kind of export projects that y'all are dealing with, except surface water, a couple of things. One, you have to prove no harm to that basin. And then the priority, and typically when you look at that kind of a project, you're looking at a high priority or a more senior water right to move. It loses all of its priority. You lose all of the priority, and basically the water right becomes useless. So you can't use surface water in Texas outside of a basin to address a concern in one of the larger metropolitan areas, for example, right now. Okay, I think that's from a policy standpoint, it's a very bad law. That's where we should start. Okay, Now I'm going to get a really unpopular. I think we need to change the law with respect to exempt permits being allowed to pump up to 25,000 gallons a day. People don't pump that much use that much water in a month in most places. So that right isn't realistic, because all of you testify in public hearings or in public presentations that that's not the average. The average is closer to 400 gallons a day or something like that, something much more reasonable. So that number needs to be reduced, because once that number gets reduced, then the science or the landscape of what you're looking at of what's
Waterscape.
the waterscape changes dramatically. The second thing I would do is I would mandate meters on every well, not to change the exempt status or to do anything from a regulatory perspective to exempt uses, but to generate the science. Get the data you need to know actually how much water is being pumped. So when you do develop the aquifers, okay, and you develop science on the aquifers, you know what the exempt well contribution is. We see that in the bill that was introduced in this session by Representative Harris, it talks about the total production and, you know, looking at what includes the exempt wells. Well, we don't know what exempt wells pump because we don't have meters on them. And I don't mind if districts in some of their funding and TWDB funding pay for those meters to be installed, but we need a statute that mandates meters and mandates reporting so you have the benefit of that data, okay? Those are among some of the things that I would like to see change. I would also like to see groundwater regulated on a regional basis based upon the aquifer, not based upon county lines. I think that they should have representation from all of the counties, all of the current local district configurations, but we need to regulate the aquifer. Again, 98 districts, 98 different sets of rules over the same groundwater. We need consistency, and I think that would help balance what it is we're doing. I think we do need to emphasize conservation in the sense of providing funding or mandating that we start plugging up the pipes, okay, and all the leaks we have. And people like to make targets of the big cities because the bigger the city, the bigger their losses are going to be. But all of you who live in rural communities, and many of you who also participate in the local water supply corporation boards, and I'm not knocking these people. This is a system that was developed to get water to people. They operate on a, quote, nonprofit shoestring budget, and they minimize, put Band-Aids on things rather than repairing lines, increasing line size, increasing efficiencies, things like this. That needs to change, and those kinds of investments, I think, would be very useful. The concept of conservation in place doesn't work because unless you can build some kind of a coffer dam or something around the aquifer on your property line, water moves. That's a physics fact, and there's nothing we can do about that. Again, another program that trying to remember how long ago it was, but early on, you know, when I do projects, and I tell the districts I'm in front of, you've all heard me say this if I've been in front of you, I wouldn't be here with my project if I believed that it was going to dry the aquifer, because the simple greed factor that people talk about, you know, when they talk about water pirates and stuff, if I can't even recover the investment in the project because I drained the aquifer, why are you going to do the project? You know, you're not going to make a profit. So well-run projects aren't going to be a problem. I also, if I could do it, I would like to see something the equivalent of the Rural Electrification Act that then Senator Johnson was a big proponent of and did a lot for the state, that we go in and get rural Texas on centralized water systems. And I'd like to see it for two reasons. One is provide reliable resources. Two, ensure that the water quality meets the drinking water standards you know, where science has gotten to the point where the number of chemicals and contaminants that we can measure and the health effects is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And private wells don't have the protection, don't have the treatment, aren't regularly tested. But for when programs like Gary's and most of your districts do, where somebody brings in a sample and they do some basic testing of water quality, these people are drinking who knows what. And so I'd like to see that change.
Okay, thanks, Ed. We have just a few more minutes, and I want to make sure we can get to a question or two, but I have last question for Tiffany, and maybe if there's a second y'all want to weigh in. Chief Justice Heck also mentioned this when he was talking about how, you know, groundwater districts are governmental entities. There may be a point at which they're going to have to take private property through their regulation in order to manage to protect the public, the need that the public has in ensuring groundwater is available in the future. Do you think that we're heading in that direction right now in the state with drought and the pressure that we're having? And then if that's the case, what are some of your thoughts for how the GCDs can pay for these taking claims? Should they actually amount to that?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person up here to speak to that. I mean, I would defer to Gary, who's having to deal with those real issues in the real world, right? But I mean, I do think from a GCD perspective, when we have a law in the books like Bragg, that's something that they have to consider, right? And is that something that they should be looking to be spending money toward or collecting money toward or figuring out a way to include that in kind of their decision making and planning and finding this balance? I think it's a real question that they should be considering. Whether or not we're there yet and exactly how to do that, I'll defer to the experts on that. That's certainly not my lane.
Do y'all want to follow up?
Well, I mean, I appreciated what the Chief Justice said about the Penn Central case. You have to go a long way before you can prove taking, and that does help us. But sooner or later, I mean, if the pressures continue to grow and if surface water law doesn't change and surface water doesn't move, and I really enjoyed that long, early in the session discussion between three river authorities on a panel. That was great. But if that doesn't change, then yeah, sooner or later you're going to get to a point where there is a maximum that's withdrawn from these aquifers, and if we're going to lean toward investment-backed expectation, that doesn't leave room for new projects or new people to come and get in line. And so that's one of the things we've always tried to emphasize is that all of us in here, groundwater folks, are familiar with the term haircut. And what that means is that the people who currently produce would suffer a small loss of what they produce to make room for the new guy coming in that applies for a permit. And so I think Ed brought up a great point a while ago. Permits are issued so that you can regulate. They're not issued because you just wanted to give one away. Permits are issued to enable us to regulate, identify and regulate, and that's important. So that's my take on that question.
Well, from someone that spent an entire career as a regulator,
You would know.
Yes, you issue permits to regulate. You also have to have unquestionable authority to enforce. And I think that that's something that needs to be revisited as well. The other thing that needs to be revisited, we can talk about how our district's going to pay for a taking that they initiate. Well, the districts need to have authority to actually collect for the fees that they need to be able to defend themselves. Not all districts have the same authority to collect. And so we need to address that as well. One point I wanted to, if I was king for a day, let me go back to that one real quick. One of the difficulties that I see in the way we are pursuing water, and I think it's evident as an underlying issue in this discussion, even if you go to the state water plan, you open it up and you look at the executive summary, how do we quantify what's going to happen to Texas in our future if we do not implement strategies? We identify it as a socioeconomic cost of not producing water. That means that you're tilting the balance towards production. It is valid to recognize that if we fail to meet our future needs and demands, that it's going to have a socioeconomic impact. But guess what? Yes, water moves, groundwater moves, but if I'm pumping, I can influence which way it's moving and how rapidly as well. That also invites for me a discussion of the socioeconomic impact at the area of origin, and that needs to be balanced at the same level?
Yeah, we've been doing that in GMA 12 now for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. Because of all the monitoring wells and the changes in water level, we've addressed, I don't know, $1.5 million over the last 4 years in changes that we've made to people's water wells by lowering pumps or drilling new wells. We've also predicted out decades into the future how many more wells will be affected, to what extent, so we can bring information to the table. And that's a very valid point that you bring up, and something we've been trying to focus on as well. Because that balance that Ed talked about, that Tiffany talked about, that you talked about, Vanessa, I mean, that's really what this is about. Are you being reasonable? Are you balancing needs on both sides?
You're using science.
Yeah, are you using science to validate your findings? Leaking pipes, yeah. Folks, one of the things I don't ever leave the microphone without saying is, if you want 20% more water, 30% more water, replace those 70-year-old water lines you got. I tell cities this. That's why I don't get asked back. We have a grant program where we help our local folks to replace leaking pipes, because that's a huge loss across the entire state. Conjunctive use, that has to start happening. If you need more water, look for resilient supplies. Don't look for the cheapest supply. That's going to serve you well for a decade or two, and then you're going to be high and dry. Look for resilient supplies. Look for ways to use surface and ground. Y'all got to get rid of the box, not just think outside the box. You got to get rid of the box.
Okay. Do we have time for one question? Okay. Does anyone have a question? We've got one question.
Thank you, Rebecca Smith. I'm a hydrogeologist. I like the idea that you want to increase collection of scientific data, both from pumping wells and models. But what we need to pay attention to are, the data that are going into these models. We don't have enough data. We've been creating a lot of models without enough data. And Ed, to your point about monitoring all wells, not all wells are equal. Many private wells are completed in multiple zones. So if you're just pumping water, you don't necessarily know which aquifer it's coming from or what water-bearing zone it's coming from. So I think we need more dedicated monitoring.
Anyone want to respond to that?
Amen.
Well, I agree that more monitor wells, and again, one of the projects we worked on early on, we offered, 15 years ago, with this, nobody ever thought about this, we offered monitor wells as part of the program to support the impacts of our proposed project, and that's now being implemented. And I think monitor well requirements, depending upon the size of a project, or a legitimate regulatory tool that groundwater districts should incorporate into their program. And again, any good self-respecting project, I think, wants to provide that data to you. Rebecca, with respect to your comments, I know all wells aren't created equal. I wish we had a rule that said those older wells that are completed in multiple formations had to be re-drilled. And from a new well perspective, it's illegal to do that, to complete more than one formation. But again, if you put a meter on every well, that data would be an incredible wealth of data that I think would be helpful.
His address is Ed McCarthy.
I'm happy to give you my address, phone number. I've got cards. Again, I'll have these conversations with each of you anytime. But a lot of you are doing a great job. Okay, I'm not always criticizing. I've helped create groundwater districts, but I go back to the history where I can tell you why many of them were created. It wasn't about science. It wasn't about the aquifer. But anyway, love to talk to y'all anytime. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we just scratched the surface of what is a much bigger conversation, so hopefully we can continue to have that during this summit. I really appreciate y'all being here, and thank you so much for listening, and hope to visit with everyone. So thanks.